Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality. It may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
Podcast where we are attacking shame anywhere we can get it. It's kind of the goal here, and to also educate and to talk about all kinds of different things. So usually about once a month we do a Symmetry counseling panel where I invite some of my providers who work for our entity to discuss some current events. So that's what we're here to do today, and we're excited to talk about a few things in the next 40 minutes or so. So we don't have as much time today as usual, so we'll just kind of get started. I've got Michelle Peets with me from the Salt Lake City area, as well as Rachel Larson, also in the Salt Lake City area. So excited to have you both here. Yeah, Michelle, you want to get us started on kind of a topic that we thought might be interesting to bring up?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that we want to talk about today is an article from CNN. It's titled "Science of Social Media's Effect on Mental Health Isn't as Clear-Cut as a Warning Label May Suggest." Long title. In essence, it's saying, so the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Murthy, I think this was last week, he called the mental health crisis in young people an emergency that demanded action without waiting for perfect information. So meaning he wants to put kind of like a tobacco style warning on social media. And this has been, from what I understand, a pretty controversial topic, because I think a lot of people on the outset would say, yeah, absolutely. We've seen a lot of issues with social media since it began, right? Some of us who remember the days before social media versus now can even feel the difference in ourselves. And then we look at the younger generation and we say, wow, like these are people who grew up with this. They're digital natives, right? Who grew up with smartphones in their hands from a young age. And there's just a difference, right? But it's kind of hard to label what that looks like and how problematic that actually is. And so this article kind of goes on to talk about like, okay, they've done all this research. They went through, I think it was like 15 different studies. Sorry, 150 different studies on the relationship between social media and mental health in adolescents. They found there was an overall link between anxiety and depression in adolescents and the time they spend on social media platforms. I'm just reading from the article here, as well as a link between the types of activities and content they were interacting with. But the level of impact varied enough to suggest that the findings shouldn't be generalized to the population as a whole. And I thought that was kind of interesting because, I think every generation kind of goes through its fear of different things, whether it's like unwanted pregnancies, STDs and STIs, right? And I think social media has just become largely ours, right? Even the concern over the use, like screen usage. And we have terms like internet addiction, screen addiction, things like that. So this is absolutely kind of like the concern of our time. And yet, if they look through 150 studies and they're still struggling to understand what that is, of course, there's a debate over, do we put warning labels on this? And the article goes on to basically say, even if we put warning labels on it, this isn't necessarily something that's just going to solve the problem. There's a huge impetus here for parents and educators and other people who carry influence in young people's lives to actually adequately help them understand how usage can impact them either positively or negatively. So there's something being required of us way beyond just like kind of slapping a label on something. And this is significantly different than putting it on tobacco products, right? Where it's like there's a very clear link between tobacco usage and all kinds of health issues down the road. This one's kind of like, well, there are actually positive effects of social media as well. And so anyway, it's an interesting discussion. I think that's kind of my summary. If you guys want to jump in.
Yeah, no, I think this is really interesting. It's kind of like our love-hate relationship with technology in general. So I think of the many ways social media has not only just been positive, but even life-saving, especially for like minority populations, LGBTQ folks, for example, if you live in a rural area or a non-affirming space, and to be able to find people like you. I'm also noticing like a big trend on neurodivergence and TikToks and like so lots of actually really helpful information by people who are educated. I see this also in the sex therapy field where it's social media can be such a platform to gather good information from good influencers or good well-educated people. And then there's the shadow part of that, right? Like there's all the crappy information. There's all the ways we don't necessarily want, especially our teens, to be influenced. And I always think about this kind of like cognitive dissonance that we have, that we're uncomfortable with anything that doesn't agree with our point of view. And so there's this trend, and we've known this forever with the internet, is that people will trend to only seek the information they already agree with, right? And so I think there was this big hope that when the internet came along that, there'd be all this information, we'd all be open to new ideas, but that hasn't really been the case. And when I think about anxiety and depression, I notice sometimes that this idea that, usually on social media, most people are putting their best foot forward. It's like people look really nice and they're smiling and there's, great stories and look at us and look at all the things I have and all the things I've accomplished. And so you're comparing yourself to a lot of things that are not necessarily realistic, and so I used to call this church syndrome, right? Like you go to church with people on Sundays and everybody's on their Sunday best. So you're comparing your regular life to what everybody seems to be portraying on a Sunday, in the pews. Well, now we do that all the time, on social media. And so I can see how that can really be confusing. Plus, we know that scrolling and things like that can affect sleep quality, especially late at night, not only just from the, keeping your brain stimulated, but just the light, in your eyeballs and all these things. So I do think it's good that we're having conversations about this. I do think it's important to talk to our kids about it. There can be some really difficult trends on social media, like things like, just kind of as a trigger warning, like just cutting or things like that, if your teen is called into some of those things, that there can be a lot of like even eating disordered spaces that they're not getting, that they're kind of almost being encouraged to have really unhealthy behaviors. So it can be scary. My main thing though is that even if it's scary, we can't just forbid it. Forbidding doesn't work. Controlling and monitoring to the level of, I know a lot of parents who, I think, well-intentioned parents, and they're scared and they're afraid. And so they just take these kind of very strict, rigid approaches, and that can have a backfire effect because eventually your kid is not going to be in your home. And how are they going to know how to deal with some of these things?
Yeah, I was thinking some of those same things for parents, and being a parent, growing up with a growing up parent, with learning how to navigate some of these things with my children. That was one of the things that, like, a huge fear, right? Like screen time. Screen time was like a really big deal. How do you limit your kids' screen time? What's going to happen if they have too much screen time? What types of screen time are harming them? That kind of stuff. So the fear was really, really difficult to battle. And I think looking at it from a mental health perspective now, because Natasha, to your point, none of this is going away. And so learning how to navigate it is much healthier than trying to learn how to avoid it. And so I'm thinking of some of the actionable steps that you could take as an individual and also as a parent, since a lot of the time this is what happens with parents, just get really fearful about how do I help my kids. And I was just thinking, if you're looking at your own value system, like what do you want the social media for? Are you using it to connect with people? And if you are, then maybe ask yourself, how do I like to show up in my connections? So when I go on social media, am I commenting and engaging with people in ways that are helping me connect? Am I looking for new ideas? Am I trying to enhance my personal experience? If you're looking at it as like, I just go to there to escape, then you're like, okay, what types of reels or things do you like to look at? Are we looking for puppies and penguins? Are we looking for, political things that are going to make us upset? And so really understanding what you want to use that platform for and understanding your own values so that you can engage with it in the way that is going to be healthy for you, and not letting it just run it, but you're intentionally connecting with this platform so that you can get something good out of it. I think they're good questions to ask.
Symmetry is now offering ketamine services. To find out more, go to simcounseling.com/ketamine-services.
I think another thing is like, what are my warning signs, my own warning signs, if I'm spending too much time or if it is affecting me? And then how do I set limits around that? With parents, are you setting limits with your children? Are they turning in their phones at night so that you can address the sleep stuff? Are you setting time limits on Instagram? Are we talking about what it looks like to have the real life versus the presented life, and having them be able to participate in how, like, when you feel this in your body, what kind of limit do you think you want to set? Are you tired? Like that kind of stuff, and help them engage with setting the limits so that they can start to recognize it on their own. Because when they leave your house and they don't know how to set their own limits, it's going to be a lot more of a disruptive experience than if they've had some incremental scaffolding along the way to set some limits with themselves in the social media platform and had a little bit of choice in that. Anyway, those were just some of the thoughts that I was thinking of. Is there's some actionable steps to take to really help alleviate the fear of these social media platforms.
I think to tie together both of what you guys just said, and this is so important in all of this, is that when we're faced with a new technology or a new thing that develops in our society, right away the instinct is fear. And so to actually like go in and get curious about, okay, where is this positive versus where is this negative? Where is this working for me? Where is it not? Is like we'll say a higher level of functioning. Like it requires a little bit more of you and a little bit more honesty. I want to point out something in the article that one guy says, so this is the U.S. Surgeon General who says this. One of the most important lessons I learned in medical school was that in an emergency, you don't have the luxury to wait for perfect information. You assess the available facts, you use your best judgment, and you act quickly, he wrote in an essay. The mental health crisis among young people is an emergency, and social media has emerged as an important contributor. So here he's kind of justifying the idea of like, yes, we need to do these warning labels because we don't have the luxury of time. We have to just kind of like act now in the moment. And that's the role of organizations, right? Is that sometimes they do make imperfect decisions, or we'll say inadequate. They come up with inadequate responses to things because they just have to like, we'll say, do the bare minimum and having these conversations. But then later in the article, I love this comment where it says the key is to focus on solutions that empower youth and give them choices and opportunities to maximize the benefits of social media use while minimizing risks, as opposed to taking restrictive and surveillance-based approaches that are heavily rooted in fear. The goal should be to ensure proper use, not just to focus on the risks and harm. And I think why I love this so much is because as therapists, this is kind of what we're doing. I mean, I think about how we work in the realm of sexual health, and a lot of us come from this background, right, of like institutions that spread and diffuse so much fear around sex, right? You're going to have unwanted pregnancies, you can have the STDs, the STIs, like all this kind of stuff. And so the conversation gets like overly simplified and reduced down, and it erases all of the complication of, what does sexual health actually look like, right? How do you enjoy a sexual relationship with someone else, with yourself, all kinds of things? How do you practice that autonomy? And so we're the ones who are kind of having those conversations with people, right? Of like, actually, that was the institution's response to this that was largely fearful because it's looking at these stats or these numbers and these problems in mass. But you are an individual in that. How do we look at that? And that grows way more complicated. And so we have to remember that, like, as we're looking at some of these societal issues, yes, that can get really scary when we add up all the people who are struggling with this stuff. But can we hone in? Can we hone in on your experience? Can we understand what's happening within your brain, your body, your life as you're interacting with something like social media? And can you take ownership of that?
Awesome. I love it. And I think a lot of this too is just thinking about community, right? So, which kind of falls under our realm of faith transitions. And we work with a lot of people who are leaving church community, and for better or for worse, church community oftentimes offers a lot of activities and things for youth to be involved in. And if they don't no longer have that, what are you replacing that with? What are other types of communities you can get your family or children or teens involved with, so that they're having more in-person types of relationships and not just relying so much on social media for social needs. So that's just another kind of thought I had as we were talking about this. So really interesting stuff. All right, so moving on to our next topic. So on, let's see, June 11th, the Southern Baptist Convention had their annual meeting. Basically, they decided to kind of offer a formal opposition to IVF, in vitro fertilization. And I'm noticing also that there's like some political kind of legal issues happening around this topic as well in certain states. So we just want to kind of bring, attention to this topic. I know in our faith community, as far as the faith community we all come from, which is Mormonism, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I've never heard of any formal opposition to IVF. But it does create this kind of ethical, moral debate about kind of when life begins. And if you believe it begins at conception, then these embryos, right, that are being created and frozen and used for IVF, this is kind of where this issue is coming from. So there was some interesting reaction to that. And I just thought I'd read a few of the quotes, because I think the concern or the struggle for a lot of people as they listen to their church, come up with these ideas is that, well, many of us have already, relied on IVF. We have IVF kids. We've practiced IVF. And so that's hard. So there's a person in here that says, I think it's important to remember that any child is a gift from the Lord. There's no caveat about only if they were created in this way. Of course, there's a lot of things that we're not talking about here about the pain of infertility and what that means for a lot of couples. And the rise of infertility is on the rise for a variety of reasons. That's another topic we could get into another day. But, this woman also said sometimes within the infertility community, this idea that just adopt, that phrase can be really harmful. It really ignores a lot of, first of all, barriers to adoption, complications around adoption, just cost about adoption, a lot of different things and feelings that people have about family planning. And so she says it's not that simple to say because IVF includes the possibility of embryos being destroyed that it should be condemned and it's immoral. What I want people to understand who are forming opinions is that they are probably hurting someone who they likely care and love about. These congregations are likely filled with IVF parents, with IVF babies, with IVF children. It completely broke my heart for all of us in the situation who likely wouldn't be parents without it. Her own church home, she said, has been supportive, and her women's group prayed for her. She faced infertility and celebrated when her daughter was born. So as we see a lot of times in our faith community, there's differences of opinion, even within the same church family system. There's different congregations that might, react in different ways. But family planning is definitely a very difficult topic in today's political world, whether it's through IVF or abortion rights or, things of that nature. So I just wondered if either one of you had any comments or thoughts about this topic.
Yeah, I mean, I see so much of the parallel with this and yeah, with our church experience and our faith community, that what starts sometimes as targeted toward a marginalized community, maybe like the LGBTQ, starts to actually impact other people who aren't a part of the queer community. And so, for example, like we're looking at, in the LDS church, with everything that's gone on with LGBTQ topics and policies that have been established, it started with hurting the queer community. But then what about like all the family members, right, who were impacted by that, who had queer kids, who had queer siblings or parents? And so all of a sudden it starts to include everyone else. And so this is interesting with IVF too, right? That a lot of this has been based in homophobia, transphobia, all kinds of things, that then all of a sudden it gets extended out to like, wait, what about all the heterosexual couples out there, right? Who, and this story in particular, it's a story of, this woman who she and her husband used IVF to get pregnant with their daughter. And so I think that's important in the context of all of this, of like, what we sometimes, when we try to like target one group, we actually realize, oh, wait a minute, this could actually impact us who have, privilege. And so all of a sudden we care about this thing. And it's like, well, where was that to start with? Right? Like, and so in the article, it talks about how, especially younger generations are starting to decline in their attendance, like pretty drastically. And then it just mentions at a time when 1 in 6 adults globally experience infertility. So all of a sudden it's this like 1 in 6, like around the world, struggle with this. Maybe we're not like so different as we think. And maybe if we can treat each other like ourselves, like that would be really powerful. And I don't know, I think it's kind of sad how much religion is starting to lose attendance because they are actually pushing out the exact people that they would want to keep. And so these people aren't necessarily leaving because they're just like, well, I just wanted to leave, I'm done. It's because they feel like they can't participate and like live their day-to-day lives, in this specific situation, creating families as they're wanting to do and as the church is wanting them to do. So it's just, I don't know, it's sad to me.
One thing that was coming up for me as you were talking about that is this idea of like moral price tagging, where you take your own opinion and then put a moral price tag to it, and then impose that on other people as if everybody should accept the same price, like the price tag of it, and agree that this is what it equals for everyone. And even when we're talking about abortion rights or things like that, not everybody even believes when the soul, even if they believe in souls, enters that body. And so whose belief are we prioritizing? Is it the Christian belief that it is at conception? Is it the more of a Hebrew belief that it happens at the breath of life, which is just as beautiful a notion as somebody else's belief, and so whose are we going to prioritize and why? And I feel like it's coming down to the societal idea of like we can't regulate ourselves and like in the way that we try to impose our beliefs on someone else to make ourselves feel really comfortable. If you accept this, like everybody has to accept this. And I think it's really hard when we refuse to see how relative morality really is. And so when you say, I will live my life this way according to my values, that's beautiful. But then when you say, and it makes me more comfortable if you live your life away this way too, then you start imposing things. And then you have like this nationwide issue where someone's like, well, I want children and I love them. And I believe all children are a blessing, a gift, a whatever. And then my ability to get them is limited by your beliefs. Like that's where we really have to allow ourselves to like ask myself, am I overstepping? Is it me? Am I imposing my beliefs on someone else by taking this stand? And it was based on an opinion. And that's kind of an uncomfortable thing to look at because we don't always want to be wrong. And we really believe the things that we believe. Like they're strong for us, So it is like I feel like it kind of comes down to self-regulation and that emotional maturity to be able to say, but I can't impose this on anyone else. Therefore, I will stay in my lane even if I'm going to be loud in my lane, that's fine, but I'm not going to try to impose my lane on someone else. That's a really hard thing to rein in. And I think we're seeing a lot of emotional stuntedness and immaturity because people are trying to just overstep. They're getting out of their lane. They're expressing their opinion and then saying, and now you gotta.
Yeah, I think that's such an important part of, this kind of more difficult conversation that we have in this country often of religious freedom. And are we conflating our own religious freedoms or our freedoms to have our own values and beliefs versus imposing our beliefs on other people? And I think that's what we're seeing a lot in the political discussions these days. I mean, it was in February, the Alabama Supreme Court decided that frozen embryos are children. And that goes right against what you just said. If you come from the Jewish faith, that's not going to be your belief. And I don't know how many mainstream Latter-day Saints understand that historically that was our belief as well, that life begins at birth, not at conception. So even not all Christians have that same belief system. And it gets really complicated when people are trying to impose their morality on others in these legal ways. And it's, to your point, Michelle, of people leaving organized religions, like these are the kinds of things that start making it for people who do want to have faith, who do value their faith communities, but when their faith communities don't make space for their experiences, for their life circumstances, then people feel like, well, I don't even have a space in my own home. I know that's what happens with tons of LGBTQ folks. They're not leaving because they don't have faith. They're leaving because there's no space for them to have faith in a way that I guess aligns with their life experiences, right? And so how rigid and how closed off do we want to be? All right, so I think that has a lot of implications, especially since we're seeing some legal actions being taken. And that to me is always what's worrisome, is when these things actually make legal, when there's just legal implications to choices that are affecting people's daily lives. Which leads us right to then, just one more thing we wanted to share. It's an article that's just kind of like a self-help article, and I'll put it in the link. But strategies for managing election stress. Dun, dun, dun. We're in that space again. I'm sure many people are aware that we had the first presidential debate last night. We just went through an election process. Kind of more on the local spaces. So this stuff creates a lot of feelings, a lot of different, it exacerbates the understanding that, I may have different values, different ideas, different opinions from my spouse, from my family members, from my community members, from my neighbor, my best friends. And boy, have we seen this really show up, I would say, in the last, it's always been there, but especially I would say in the last few elections, and especially with COVID and a lot of the, feelings around vaccines and environment and politics and reproductive rights and you name it, right? We're all fighting about it. So so some of the experiences in this, or some of the advice, in this article, and we can talk a little bit more about it. It's just being aware of your feelings, accepting your feelings, just kind of taking a mindful approach, kind of focusing on what you can control. Many of us try to get into convincing mode. I think we've talked oftentimes on this podcast that convincing is not very effective. The things that can be effective are active listening. It's hard to listen to opinions that you don't agree with. Trying to find commonality at some level. I always call this like doing, emotional math. Like, can we find the common denominator? It may take a while. Remember those fractions that we had to find a common denominator for? You may have to go really pretty high up in the numbers to find that, but usually we have some common denominators in our values. Self-care, right? So understanding how stress affects you. When do you need to take media breaks? When is it just not helpful to continue to listen to, more and more things? Are you listening to a variety of things, or, are you a person who only listens to one type of media? So, and, just trying to take care of our mental health, good boundaries, right? So lots of tips and tricks kind of in this article, but I thought I'd give you both a chance to just kind of comment on how difficult this is.
I'm just thinking about have the experience more than anything of like clients coming into my office highly dysregulated and being like, what's going on? Right. And they're like, I've been reading a whole lot about, we'll say like Israel and Palestine, right? Or yeah, of like the elections or whatever it is. And it's like I remember the first time it happening, like almost being shocked that the level of dysregulation came from political stuff. And then realizing like, well, but why not? Like of course this makes perfect sense that this is kind of what we were talking about with the social media stuff too, that it's like when you're looking at things in mass, that gets overwhelming. One human's mental health and the struggle they go through and the pain and all of that is already a lot. So then you multiply that by, however many people, 300 million people plus in this country, like that's a lot. That's a lot to take on. That's a lot to feel. And so um that's both beautiful that we're becoming more aware than ever before of what's going on in our country as well as our world. And uh I don't know how equipped we are. I don't know how much the human psyche can actually manage that regularly. I'm not sure we've like evolved adequately. So I'm not saying like disconnect from it. I think it's actually extremely important that we do this. I think it's having like a huge impact on us as humans just to be more aware and for our worlds to have been enlarged in this way. And can we hold ourselves in compassion, recognizing that like this has been a huge shift in our evolution as humans to actually be able to carry this? And in the meantime, can we ask ourselves the questions of like, when can I handle this? When can I not? And can I know the difference?
Yep, I totally agree with that. Boundaries and like awareness and boundaries, right, is really important. Rachel, your thoughts?
Yeah, I was just thinking about like certain strategies that you could employ when these conversations come up, like asking yourself, just doing a quick check-in. How do I like to show up in interactions? What behaviors am I always proud of? What things connect us? And do I really need to focus on the two little things in our lives that don't connect us? Like, does this conversation have to happen or whatever? And what limits do I want to set for myself? For me, sometimes I have to set the limit that like I will listen to this topic in the comfort of my car while I'm listening to a podcast. And then I can talk to myself about it, check in with my feelings and decide how I feel before I engage in a conversation with anyone else. I will do that discussion in the comfort of my car so that I can like settle in with my emotions. So that when I do have a conversation, I can separate my emotions from someone else's. And I think one great strategy is just like the emotional boundary that you can set between someone's emotions and your emotions when you are listening to someone talk and be able to just say internally, you don't even have to say it externally, but just they seem upset. That automatically separates your emotions from theirs, or they seem stimulated by this. They seem passionate about this. They seem convinced of this. And that automatically separates their feelings from your feelings. So that's a full stop. You don't even have to go any further than that to say, I should do something about this, or I need to convince them, because automatically your responsibility is only yours emotions. And you can let their political views be their responsibility. And that's one thing that I have to do to check in with myself, because I often try to like feel like I gotta be responsible for somebody's view, especially if I feel like, well, that's not really educated. You need to know this and this and this, or I read this study, or I had this information, and I feel like I gotta disseminate the information. Sometimes I have to check in with myself and say, am I really responsible for their point of view? No, I'm not. And so I can go ahead and like let them have it. It's not that big of a deal. And then spend my energy with the connection with them. Let's talk about that smoothie place that we actually really like. Should we go there? Not that we can't engage in important topics, because these are really important topics, but there are times when you have to set limits with yourself and say, this topic can't be engaged with right now while I am dysregulated or whatever. Anyway, those were just some of the thoughts I was having as you were talking about
Yeah.
strategies, because it can escalate quick, right?
Yeah, right. And I just like to remind everybody that our stupidity levels increase as our escalation increases. And that's not because
Amen. Oh, that's all of us. I don't care how
That's all
evolved
of
we
us.
think we
That's
are.
any
We
human.
get stupider the more passionate we are on a topic sometimes.
Our IQ actually lowers because the way we haven't evolved yet for the main danger to be psychological. We're still evolved to think of physical danger. So whenever we're escalated, our blood and everything goes to our extremities, you know, our legs and our hands so that we can fight or run or whatever. It doesn't go to our brain. So anytime somebody's escalated with us or we're noticing our own escalation, it's a good time to take a time out and take a break because we're not in our best thinking. So anyway, a few thoughts, a few tips, be thinking about it, be mindful about it. It's hard. Many of us avoid it with a 10-foot pole. We avoid people, we avoid conversations. That's one way to cope. And other people fight, you know, and I don't know that either one is super healthy, but it's just kind of notice how you show up in these spaces and give yourself a chance to think about how you want to survive the election season. I just wanted to make, let's see, we got a comment from Meredith Wolf. They say, I have never thought about how I didn't leave because of lack of faith. I left because I couldn't be myself in the church and be accepted. So thank you for that. So that was a helpful comment for her to hear. And then Stephen Boylan is talking a lot about religious trauma. He says, since leaving, I've been obsessed with restudying everything I do. Think about like from a religious trauma syndrome lens. It's I know what it is, but I can't stop thinking about how wrong it is and how many times I've literally lied to people because of what I supposedly knew. So that kind of fits in with this political stuff. Like sometimes, especially if we've had a shift of belief, we are really hard on our older self or, you know, our younger self, I guess. And I think it's really important to just give ourselves a lot of grace. Like a lot of times we do shift in beliefs, we do shift in political leanings, we do either way, you know, like lots of people are shifting their ideas. And I think most of us, if we can just give people the benefit of the doubt, most of us are doing the best we know how, and we probably did the best we knew how. And if we know now better, we do better. That's Maya Angelou, right? But we don't have to necessarily go into this huge guilt spiral or shame spiral about having been in a different place. That's really part of the human predicament. Most of us are going to go through several ideological shifts and changes throughout our life, and that's normal. That's a normal part of being human. So all right, everybody, thank you for joining me today. Thank you, Rachel and Michelle, for your time, and have a great rest of your weekend, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Nordisch geschehen aber so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Nordisch geschehen aber so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland